Hello, I'm Dr. Chuck Kowalewski, a S3 controller with the Jacksonville ARTAC. I'm also a real-world IFR pilot with about 5,000 hours and a mentor for Jacksonville ARTAC. We've put together these slides for you so that you can go through the classroom instruction in Jacksonville and not have to actually schedule a one-on-one time for the slides. The slides do not include the embedded videos. You get to do them on your own if you need them. However, at the completion of the slides, once you start booking your training in Sweatbox, there will be a knowledge check to ensure that you've understood the slides that we're going over today. So the first class we're going over is the Class 1 for the S1 rating, Introduction to Air Traffic Control. In this class, we're going to go over the FAA 7110.65. We're going to go over the mission, duty, priority of air traffic control, and what the National Airspace System is about. What is the FAA Order 7110.65, or since that's a tongue twister, we call it the .65. Well, this is the order that goes to all FAA controllers by which their controlling behavior and how they do things is identified. It has all of the procedures and phraseology that are used by air traffic controllers in that document. And we'll be centering your training around the same document that real-world air traffic controllers are using. It is going to be important that you have your own copy of this document, a copy or a link of which will be in the descriptions in the video. But you can also get it from a mentor or an instructor if you aren't able to get it downloaded from the video. So our first thing is, how do you even read the .65? Well, it's broken down into chapters, sections, and topics. For example, if you wanted to find the topic of route or altitude amendments, then you'd be directed to Chapter 4, Section 2, and Topic 5. Now, as we refer to that during this class, we'll call it the 4-2-5, or something like that, depending on the area we're in. What is the mission, duty, and priority of the air traffic controller? Now, this is all going to be in 2-1-1 through 2-1-3 of the .65. So it's right at the top, which shows you how important this information is. Number one is to prevent a collision between aircraft operating in the system. That's always your number one priority, above any other task you need to do. Number two is to provide support for the national security and homeland defense. That doesn't really apply so much in VATSIM, obviously, since it's a simulated environment. But we do still observe whether people are using the system properly. So we're more interested in not having people practicing military maneuvers in VATSIM or doing things, I mean, as terrible as it sounds, practicing flying into buildings would be of concern to a controller observing that activity. So, and if you ever do see that, by the way, please reach out to one of the Jacksonville ARTAC staff members so we can take a look at that. And number three is to organize and expedite the flow of traffic. So these are the primary duties of air traffic controllers. Number three, by the way, we just colloquialize that and call it push and 10. You'll hear that a lot. There are also additional services that we provide. And they are things to include, not limited to, but to include traffic reports, weather delay information, airport hold programs, and we don't see that too much except during events when the virtual airspace gets congested, and we do have ground holds then, or VFR flight following. We'll talk a lot more about that later, but we do provide VFR flight following. So, and this is the ability to provide these additional services, however, are still limited by a large variety of factors, not the least of which are the primary three directives, but also volume of traffic, frequency congestion, meaning everybody's talking on the frequency at once and you can't get your word in edgewise. The quality of the radar, not so much a concern in VATSIM. Controller workload, definitely a concern for you. This is why you'll really want to practice the phrases in the .65 and get them down efficiently, because that contributes to your workload. And the best thing you can do to reduce your workload is to have those phrases rolling off the tip of your tongue. So you'll be practicing them a lot. And the other higher priority duties, as I already mentioned, and sometimes just there's so many aircraft in the sector you're covering that you can't see them all at the same time despite having a good scan. So it's recognized that the only thing the .65 is trying to tell you is these other activities come secondary because it's recognized that things can get busy, particularly during events or FNO, which is Friday Night Online, that sort of thing. So does that mean they're not required? Absolutely not. In fact, they generally are required. However, you need to prioritize what you can do, and you need to make your phraseology and controlling as efficient as possible so you can do all the simultaneous services. So it's not optional, but you will prioritize how you do the primary services and the additional services based on the situation. Now we have another thing here called, it's in VATSIM and it's in the 2-1-4, which is that we generally provide services to the aircraft first come, first serve. That means generally if somebody calls in for a clearance and then somebody calls in for a request to taxi, the person who called in for clearance will usually get their services first if you're covering both clearance, for example, on ground. And the subtlety in this is that in the simulations, people can be Air Force One. They can pretend to be a medical flight. In the real world, they would in fact get prioritized services, not in VATSIM. In the simulation, we stick to the first come, first serve basis. So we do add a little bit to that, give the first priority to separating aircraft and safety alerts, and then use good judgment for prioritizing all the other provisions of the order based on your situation at hand. Common sense. We're going to go over the air traffic control positions now. Generally, they're broken down into two parts. They're broken down into the terminal function, which manages traffic in and out of an airfield, and the in-route function, which manages traffic in between the terminal functions, right? The in-route function also provides the VFR flight following we mentioned. We're going to go through each position. The clearance delivery position is the position that makes sure that the flight plan is accurate and valid, and in the real world ensures that they have a correct route and a release time. In the VATSIM environment, we do try to get people to use the FAA recommended routes, and we do have some arrangements with our surrounding ARTCC to do so. We don't really see release times except for major events such as cross the pond. And then, yes, we have to do that as well, which is why during a major event like that, you'll probably find one of the most experienced controllers is actually assigned to clearance delivery. We also coordinate this information with the en route center and the ground controller. The ground controller, so he knows where they're going to be taxiing to on the airfield, particularly if it's not a standard route, and with the en-route controller or TRACON as need be if the clearance that they have is not standard. That's the most common reason you'll be talking to them. The ground control position is what it says. You're probably familiar with it. This includes controlling all the airport surfaces or areas that are not released to the airlines or other users, such as all the taxiways, all the holding areas, and any identified transitional aprons or intersections that aircraft might arrive, such as coming off the runway or going into a departure gate, meaning a taxiway that just goes onto a taxi entryway is a departure gate. So that means that most of the time, the gates and the FBOs are not controlled by the ground control position. So now, any person, vehicle, aircraft who's going anywhere in the movement area is controlled by the ground controller. And anything in the non-movement area, again, that's area that's not a movement area by definition, which is for us typically ramps and gates, are not your responsibility as a ground controller. Finally, the next position is the tower position, commonly called local control, and that's what we call it as well. And they control and separate the traffic on the active runway surfaces. And sometimes within taxiways that are between two active runway surfaces will be part of the tower control. So local control clears the aircraft for takeoff and landing and ensures the runway is clear for aircraft taking off and landing. You don't want to have an airplane sitting on the runway while you have another plane cleared to land. Having two airplanes on the same runway is not considered a good thing. So we accomplished this by giving the local controller an airspace around the field between 2 and 5 miles diameter. Radius around the airfield. And they're allowed to give those clearances to land, take off, and they often will actually work with the TRACON for some of the departures to make sure that it can work within whatever TRACON's doing at the time. And TRACON, what is that? Well, that is the Terminal Radar Control Facility. Typically, they're divided into departure and approach. So the departure will control all the departing IFR aircraft and VFR aircraft within its airspace. And while this portion is primarily the airspace around the airfield, the primary airfield, it's important to notice that they also control satellite airports that are within or under that airspace. A great example of this is Orlando Executive is very close to and just under the arrival or departure airspace of Orlando International. So the TRACON would also control Orlando Executive. Approach is obviously the other way around. If they're going to be controlling IFR and VFR aircraft coming into the airspace and with intent to land. And again, it controls the primary airport and it controls the satellite airports the same way. Now, these in real life, the cab, which is the delivery, the ground controller, and the tower, on a normal real-world shift, will rotate through those three positions so that nobody gets too bored. The TRACON position typically sticks in their one airspace, although in the real world they may rotate between a busy and a quieter airspace during their shift. In the VATSIM world, we don't do that. You pick a position and you pretty much stick with that position, unless by agreement you're going to trade with somebody else after a while. That's uncommon. So the en route position, as we said, that's they're controlling the aircraft between airports, and they're located in a different place geographically, usually controlled in an en route control center. They are what gives us the name ARTAC, or Air Route Traffic Control Center. That's where the name comes from. And they operate all the IFR flights within whatever airspace they're assigned. They also control the VFR flight following for aircraft that are in their airspace. Excuse me. And we'll talk about that later. Typically, that is limited by how many aircraft are in the airspace and whether they can pick up the VFR flight following. But generally, in our VATSIM system, that's never a problem, and we can provide VFR flight following from the en route position. So the National Airspace System, let's talk about that. So there's a video here that'll be linked. This is an excellent video from Daytona Beach's flight school. I highly recommend watching it, even if you're a pilot or experienced with how airspaces work, because it's a fantastic review. We're not going to do it now, but it'll be in the links below. And then this one is a detailed looking at the west coast of Florida and pointing out some of the features on a VFR sectional. When you're working your way up, you'll want to know how to read a VFR sectional. That will help you immensely. So I encourage you to watch this video as well. Even if you're a pilot, a VFR pilot, this is a pretty good review for the VFR sectional basics. But we're going to just do the slides. By the way, each of those videos are about 15 to 20 minutes long. So what are the types of airspace? We're going to break it down simply here on the slides. So we'll go with Class A first. Class A ranges from flight level 180 to flight level 600. This is the Class A airspace. All Class A airspace is instrument flight. So if somebody files for a VFR flight plan above flight level 180, that's wrong. We'll talk about the visibility requirements. Actually, all of that's in the video. So if you need the visibility requirements for VFR and those sort of rules, go back and watch that video. The Class B airspace, so the only example that in our Jacksonville RTAC is the Orlando National Airport, is called an upside down wedding cake. And when you want to talk about it, you actually say that the Class B airspace on the map is as depicted. We'll talk about it a little bit more, but what we're saying is the shape of the Class B airspace will be defined by the topology, the city you're in, and any airspace around it that may impact it. So it's not going to necessarily be circular. Generally, it's going to have a circular base for the airfield at the bottom, however. And it routinely goes up to, it shows here flight level 180, but typically it goes up to 10,000 feet. The Class C airspace, next one down, pardon me. Well, let me go back. The Class A airspace, you're on your IFR, so you got a Mode C transponder working and you're talking to the controller, right? The Class B airspace is pretty much the same thing. You've got a Mode C transponder that's working, and you had to have been given permission to enter the Class B airspace. That's called a clearance, and it's either embedded in your IFR clearance you got before you took off. If you're VFR, you obtained the clearance by radio before you fly into the airspace. So Class C, typical Class C would be Jacksonville, where you do most of your sweatbox training. And again, it has a circular base, which is 5-mile radius around it. And then it goes up to about 4,000 feet typically. Now, 4,000 feet, I mean above ground level. When you look at it on a map, like a VFR map, it's going to be 4,000 plus whatever the mean sea level elevation is of the airfield. So because Jacksonville is only like 100 feet above the sea level, you'll see the tops are going to be rounded down to 4,000. But if you went to let's say Gulfport, then Gulfport sea level too. If you went to an airfield that was like 600 feet above sea level, then on the map you'd see 4,600 as the top of that circle. And it typically does have this upside down shape, and it typically does have a round top and a round bottom. Again, the top can be cut off or a different shape based on the airspace around it. And when you take a look at the Orlando Executive Airfield, which is actually a Class Delta, and you will see that its circle, which in a Class Delta, well, let's go back. Class Charlie, the visibility requirements you can get on the video. On a Class Charlie, before a VFR aircraft flies into it, they have to have two-way communication with the tower and they have to have a Mode C. And they don't have to have a clearance, however, but the tower does have to respond to them with their full call sign, and that implies they can enter the airspace. In the Class Delta, it's a simple circle. It's 5-mile radius around. It goes up around 2,500 feet above the ground, again, AGL. And these are quieter airfields that still need a tower to control them, but they typically don't need radar approach and departure. Sometimes a Class Delta will have instrument approaches, and that'll be indicated by the charts, obviously, but also they'll have a defined Class Echo space showing where that approach is for those aircraft, but most of them do not. So, and if you're covering a Class Delta like Orlando Executive, then all you have to do is answer the aircraft. We will train everyone to respond with their call sign, but if you just answer the aircraft, that's all they need to enter as a VFR plane. Again, if they're IFR and they're already on a clearance, they've already got clearance to come into your airspace. So Class Echo is a little strange. Class Echo is above anything that's not. Let's do Class Golf instead. We'll come back to Class Echo. So Class Golf is pretty much anything else. It's a non-towered field. It doesn't have an airspace above it. Just about anything that's not another airspace that is 700-foot AGL near an airfield or 1,200 not near an airfield is considered Class Golf. So non-towered airports with or without an instrument approach can be Class Golf. There are no requirements to enter that airspace. You can be a VFR pilot, you can be a VFR student, and you can fly in that airspace. Finally, let's go back and talk about Class Echo. Class Echo is the quote unquote everything else. So they don't depict it here, but actually above flight level 600, that's also Class Echo. There are no requirements for anything in Class Echo. You don't have to talk to anybody. You don't have to have a transponder on. Uh, you just have to maintain VFR. Uh, and really, that's the majority of airspace in the United States. So, and in VATSIM, if they're flying in Class Echo airspace, they can be flying on VATSIM and they can be squawking VFR or no squawk at all, and that's totally okay. They don't need to contact me. You're not going to wall up them with a supervisor. They're not doing anything wrong. So that actually indicates why it's important that you know the airspace. And that's why you need to be able to see a VFR sectional, because you don't want to be embarrassed by, calling somebody out and they didn't do anything wrong. As a controller, you should know better. Okay, so we'll go over the details here by the numbers. Class A begins at flight level 180, goes to flight level 600. You got to be an IFR flight plan. Got to have your squawk and squawk in mode C, and you got to have two-way radios talking to a controller. The Echo, I don't know why they're out of order, but the Echo typically starts at 1200. Again, it's 700 close to an airfield. It'll go up to flight level 180, but doesn't include flight level 180. Mode C again. Can you have a Class Echo airspace and be above flight level, be above 10,000 feet? Absolutely. Uh, it, so if you are, however, you still have to have your Mode C squawk above 10,000 because that rule's the same all the time. But you don't have to be necessarily talking to air traffic control on a VFR flight plan. So the Class Bravo is, here we got Orlando's VFR sectional up there for you to look at. It's upside down wedding cake, but really I just call it, when anybody asks me how do you define it, I say it's as depicted. And that's what your knowledge check folks are going to want you to say, is it's as depicted, because you don't really know what the shape's going to be till you look at it on a map. You have to be Mode C capable, and in fact, we'll talk about this a bit, you have to have your Mode C squawk on before you get into the Class Bravo in many cases. If you look, you'll see this little magenta line here, and if you look at it closely, it'll say 30 nautical miles Mode C. So if you're VFR flying in here, you got to turn on your Mode C and squawk VFR before you cross that red line. And you can fly there without talking to the controller in Orlando, but you definitely have to get talking to him and get permission before you cross the big blue lines. And that's for VFR. Again, for IFR who has got a clearance, they've already received the clearance to enter Class Bravo because they got an IFR clearance. Two-way radios. You got to be on two-way radio, but you don't necessarily need to be talking to them. And it's called a positive control airspace because once you get into the Class Bravo, the controller has to be talking to everybody that's in this airspace. Now, if we look at this airspace and you want to know the heights and altitudes, you can see it, for example, right here by this thing that says 10,000 and 6,000. What that says is the airspace stops at 10,000 and goes all the way down to 6,000. And if you look over here, it's 10,000 goes down to 3,000. And as you'd expect, as you get close to the field, the bases go down. So when you get much closer, it's 10,900. When you get in the center, it's all the way from the ground up to 10,000. And that's typical of most of the Class Bravos. Okay, Class Charlies. So again, you see you have the inner circle. This is where you're going to be doing most of your sweat box, and you'll notice that the outer circle is cut off here. And so when you look at this is why you have to look at the VFR sectionals to see where the airspaces are. So the Class Charlie, again, you need to be Mode C capable when you're inside the Class Charlie. So you got to have it on and squawking in some sort of code. And the VFR pilots just flying around the patch or just flying interested in the area might not actually need a squawk number. But we typically do give them a squawk code. If they're just flying patterns in Jacksonville, we often do not because we know they're not going to go out of the area. But if they are going to go out of the area for any reason at all, then they need to be, and they're going to leave this area right around the airfield, then they need a squawk and they need to be talking to the TRACON. So, and this is also the case where the VATSIM pilots love to fly around and then fly up here, and before they enter in the magenta circle, you have to have called back their call sign, and that's what tells them they can enter the area. We get a lot of VATSIM pilots who don't understand that, and they just fly on in. Okay, a class Delta airspace is the dotted blue line circle. Again, the standard 5-mile radius. It does not have irregularities in it. And most of the Class Delta airspaces have part-time towers. So that means that you have to look at the air facility directory, which is available on various websites like Aeronav or SkyVector, or you can just look at the Air Force at the airfield facility directory. Sorry. The AFFD. And that's a book that gets published, so these days it's downloadable. And you can look them up by state and alphabetized, and you can see all the information about the field. So you need to, in this area, again, if the tower is up, you need to establish two-rate communications. If the tower is not up, you still need to be on the frequency. So we'll just talk about it here. We'll talk about it again later. The Common Traffic Advisory frequency is indicated by an inverted font C with a blue circle around it. And that'll be next to whatever frequency is being used for the Common Traffic Advisory frequency. In this case, it's the control tower when the control tower is closed. There are cases where it's the Unicom frequency down here. So you have to know it by looking at the VFR sectional or checking the AFDD. What is Unicom? Well, Unicom is a frequency used to talk to the FBOs or other folks on the ground to arrange things like cars, fuel for the plane, that sort of thing. And the reason there's a second frequency for that is so that you're not tying up the control tower frequency with non-aviation issues. As long as I'm up here, I might as well point these out, that the asterisk or the star over the symbols indicates that this has got a beacon that works from sunset to sunrise. The asterisk next to the frequency is telling you that there's some special condition about this control tower frequency, and you're supposed to check and see what it is. I can tell you that what it is here is this is closed at night. It's closed at 10 p.m. They do provide a ATIS, which provides the weather and the runway conditions. Pardon me. The ground MSL elevation at the highest point of the field is 151 feet. So since it's 151 feet and the tops are usually 2,500, you can see here this box tells you the top of the airspace is 2,500 plus 151, rounded up to 2,700. This is a lighted runway field. And when the lights do not stay on from sunset to sunrise, they only go on when you turn them on. So the pilots click their microphone on the CTAP frequency, and the pop of the static is what signals the lights to come on. And I believe it's 3, 5, and 7. It might be 5, 7, and 9. So where 3 is low, medium is 5, and bright is 7. The longest runway is 7,500 feet. So that's what those boxes mean, and they're the same in all the other areas, in all the other airfields too. So I'm only doing it once here. And then notice it says see the supplement with the FDD or NOTAMs for the effective hours of this field. All right, Class Golf. They're the maroon circles. They've got a general description of which direction the runway is running, and not a whole lot beyond that. They'll tell you very simply, they'll tell you the elevation at the highest point of the field, and they'll tell you the length of the runway. But that's really all it is. Most of the time, these are private, indicated by PVT above, and so the only time you're going to land on them is when it's an emergency, and frequently, if you land there in real world, you're not taken off again. because the private airfield owner has to give you permission to take off. And they all go to 1200 AGL, and you'll notice it doesn't tell you what the top is because there's no control tower to control anyway. So you just have to know that it's 1200 AGL plus the plus whatever the elevation is. Now, this airspace can go pretty high. There are airfields that are 12,000 feet above sea level. So that's why a Class G airspace can go as high as 14,500 feet. But the key point of this is that they're 1,200 feet AGL. There's no requirements for how you get in there. You don't have to get clearance for an airspace. You don't have an IFR clearance, none of those things. And like I learned to fly in Michigan, and then I flew a lot in the middle south where there's a ton of these fields that are actually public, and you can just fly in there anytime you want just for fun. Now this is we don't have any of these, but we'd be remiss if we didn't let you know about them. There are none of these in Jacksonville. This is showing a terminal radar service area in Augusta, and this is essentially the services of a Class Bravo, but in a Class Delta airfield. The only people who have to talk to them are those on an IFR clearance. If you're on a VFR, you technically don't have to do anything but follow the rules of a Class Delta airfield in the real world as a pilot. And you need to know that as a controller if you visit another RTAC that has these. So a VFR pilot can fly whatever the VFR rules are. And it's only when they come into the dotted line that they have to at least call the tower. But the IFR clearance guys will get handed off to the TRACON in order to fly the approach. Why do we have these terses? That's what they're called. Is because these typically are airfields that in the real world have a lot of traffic, but they're either in a location where there's no regular Class Bravo or TRACON available, or they're in an area where the center, the en route, would have to cover it, and it's just too busy for them to do that, whether there are other jobs in the airspace. So when that happens, the city will often hire controllers, have a TERSA approved by the FAA, and they'll sort of run a privatized version of approach and departure control. Now since this is a Delta, this is a good example of what these magenta shaded areas are. These magenta shaded areas show pilots who are on VFR plans where the approach and departure routes are for the airfield. And that's all it's there for. So, and that indicates that this area here falls into the Class Echo airspace. Okay. We talked about the Mode C veil. As controllers, they have to have their squawk on. If somebody flies in and they're showing as a primary target, and you can figure out their call sign, yes, you can do a contact me and just let them know they need to turn on their Mode C. That's all they have to do. They don't have to check in. They don't have to be talking to you the whole time. You can certainly offer to them VFR flight following if they want it. And a lot of them will want it. Okay, special use airspace. There's another video on this. I'll put that in the link, and you can watch it. It's more fun than listening to me talk about it, but I'm going to talk about it anyway. So it's just what it sounds. It's a special use airspace, and it can be anything that doesn't fall into any of the other regulatory airspaces, right? Pardon me. So it can be a military operating area, it can be a restricted area, prohibited area, warning area, alert areas, or TFR, temporary flight restriction. Does this matter to us as controllers? Not in VATSIM. We do not restrict people from flying their simulators into any of these areas. They can fly wherever they want, and we'll still provide them services. However, for realism, sometimes it's worthwhile to let them know that a temporary flight restriction is in effect. But it's only for realism, and think about it, they're on a simulator. Somebody really wants to fly around Disney World, or they really want to fly to the Cape Canaveral skid. The best place to do that is a simulator, not the real world. So we let them do it. They're indicated by these hashed blue lines and the hashed red lines. We'll talk about that. So here, let's look at each of these. So a MOA is a military operating area. In the real world, the military controllers would notify the en route controller that they have high-speed, low-altitude aircraft maneuvering in one of these defined areas. It doesn't prohibit a VFR pilot from going in there, although an en-route controller will probably divert an IFR aircraft from flying through there, or they will at least coordinate with the military controller if they're going to do that. In the real world, most VFR pilots, it would be prudent not to fly into that area. And this is why it's prudent to have VFR flight following, because the en-route controller will advise you in the real world that you're about to fly into a military operating area that is hot or active. It doesn't mean they can't go in there. They just let them know to be extra careful. There are planes flying really fast that they're probably not going to see before they come onto a converging course. And of course, the military aircraft tend to go up and down a lot. So these MOAs go all the way up to typically flight level 180, but typically they don't go much above 10,000 feet. It depends on the aircraft and what practicing they're doing. For us in VATSIM, it doesn't mean anything at all. So restricted area, in the real world, it means that this is an area that is hazardous to aircraft and they should take extra precautions. IFR aircraft and VFR aircraft routinely fly into restricted areas. However, they have to have permission from whatever airspace owns the restricted area when it's active. So these can be turned on and off as restrictive areas. Again, in VATSIM, it doesn't apply to us. But in the real world, if an area is active, it's on the controller's burden to keep IFR aircraft out of the restricted area and to tell VFR aircraft they can't go in that area. And if a VFR aircraft goes in without permission and they're not talking to flight following, they might get a message when they land to contact the tower to talk about a possible pilot deviation. So again, in the real world, if you're flying VFR in a busy area, it behooves you to ask for flight following by the controller. Okay. Prohibited areas are exactly what they mean. In the real world, pilots can never fly into a prohibited area, ever. Here's a good example. I don't even know what it means or why it's there, but that's prohibited for some reason. In VATSIM, they can fly in there, and we don't even tell them that they can't fly in there. You just need to know that that's there because you're a controller. Again, blue hash marks with a circle around it, and it's marked with a P. You can look online and see what P-50 means, and it'll tell you. Finally, you got these warning areas, and these are areas just to let people know that just off the seaboard, there could be activity going on here that may or may not be advised to an en-route controller. Typically, that could be airplanes firing missiles at drones or naval ships firing up from the sea to air with missiles. Anything involving live fire. Some of you may remember the aircraft that went down outside of New York. It went down in one of these warning areas, and there was strong suspicion that it was due to a live fire incident. I don't think anyone's actually proven yes or no on that, although they went to great expense and time to say it was not a live fire incident. But that can happen in the real world. That can happen, and that's why this notification is here for this. And no one's, by the way, no one is considered culpable if that occurs. So an alert area is what it says. It just means to the VFR pilot, be careful, there's extra stuff going on. Could be skydiving, it could be people with gliders. It might be a lot of flight training. Daytona Beach area has some of these special alert areas because they got a ton of student pilots there. In fact, the real world satellite for Orlando approach and departure is extremely busy, unlike in VATSIM where it's not. Because of all of the training that goes on. Again, you see this, and you'll just see these icons, and you'll see a soft magenta circle around it. Finally, we have temporary flight restrictions, which is in this case an oxymoron because the temporary so-called flight restriction over Disney World is actually permanent. It's a permanent flight restriction. Uh, and that's for various, you can look it up on the blogs. That's for various political reasons, but just the same, uh, we don't enforce the TFRs in VATSIM. They are there. Uh, the one that is most commonly turned on and off is over by Cape Canaveral when the space launches are hot. And believe it or not, a lot of people like to fly in the simulator. They're not going to see a rocket, but they like to fly in the simulator just for fun in that area when those are active. Again, we do not deny services. We do not restrict them. They can fly into a temporary flight restriction area on VATSIM. Okay, I've gone through everything here. Again, I pointed out those videos. Please watch those videos if you need to or want more information on those topics. Remember that after completing this and the other two slide decks, that when you go to your first VATSIM, you'll get a knowledge check to ensure that you have adequate understanding of everything covered in these slides. Again, I'm Dr. Chuck Kowalski with the Jacksonville RTAC. Thank you for watching.